My name is Anya. I'm from the Family Homeless Alliance, and I welcome you to this webinar. It's a cooperation between the Family Homeless Alliance and the Institute of Global Homelessness, and we are very excited to have you, especially because it's summer holidays in a lot of parts of the world. So you joining us is fantastic, and we hope that this will be a space to have a really engaging and interesting conversation. We are very excited to talk to you about the Sustainable Development Goals, and hopefully by the end of the webinar, you will feel that you understand them better, that you have an idea how they might help you in your work, and understand how you can advocate with the people you support. Throughout the webinar, so during the presentation, but as well the following discussion, you are welcome to pop your questions in the chat, and we will try to answer all of them. If we will also collect them, so if we do not manage to answer your question, we will respond by email after the webinar. But now, let me introduce you to our guest speaker for today. So she is a dear colleague and friend of mine, and really a fountain of wisdom when it comes to homelessness, housing, and the Sustainable Development Goals, and working with the United Nations. She has worked at the intersections of housing, homelessness, employment, higher education, gender equity, and policy advocacy for nearly 20 years. As the executive director of the Institute of Global Homelessness, she oversees global homelessness policy development and advocacy, the Vanguard Cities program to support cities address homelessness, knowledge sharing activities that communicate what works and what doesn't to end homelessness, and she works with UN Habitat. She is a founding editorial board member of the International Journal on Homelessness. She is the chair of the NGO working group to end homelessness at the UN. And of course, she is a speaker on housing and homelessness in global forums. Also, Prince William in the UK and the Royal Foundation have asked her to join their national experts panel as a sector partner for a new initiative to end homelessness in the UK. And because that's clearly not enough, she also holds a master's degree in public policy and probably has some other things in the pipeline that I don't even know about. So I welcome Lydia Stazen. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for taking the time to help us understand the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you, Anya, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining this webinar from wherever you are in the world. I'll be speaking in my native language, English, because my Spanish is muy mal, my French is très mauvais, and the only words I know in Portuguese are obrigado and brigadeiro, which I think are the two most important words in Portuguese to know. So I will try to go slowly for our interpreters, but if I go too quickly, just wave me down, Anya, and I'll try to go more slowly. I do tend to get excited when I'm talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. I also want to say hello, especially to Jim Claffey, who is a member of the executive committee of the NGO Working Group to End Homelessness. I see him here on this call this morning from New York. So Jim will keep me honest, I'm sure, with everything I'm sharing about the UN. I'm going to share just a brief presentation with you all, but I hope that as you have questions or comments, you'll still continue to put those in the chat so that we can have more of a dialogue rather than a presentation. Can everyone see my screen okay? Great, I see some nods and thumbs up. So we are going to talk primarily today about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and how homelessness connects into those, and how our NGO working group to end homelessness has really made progress in connecting homelessness to this international agenda. I always want to start with a bit of background about the Sustainable Development Goals. I didn't know anything about them before coming into this role at IGH. So there are 17 goals that were negotiated and agreed on by the member states at the United Nations. So the member states are the countries, and so there was a couple of different years of negotiations about what the goals should be, what their targets should be, how many there should be, what the focus should be. And you can imagine with, more than 160 countries negotiating it, how complicated it was. But really having this agreed upon agenda was really significant. It's not very often that you can get all of the member states to agree on any one particular thing. So just having the goals agreed on and passed was a huge accomplishment. So you can see there are 17, which is a strange number. You can see the topics of all 17. And then underneath these high-level 17 goals, there are specific indicators, specific targets, 169 in total. So 17 overarching goals, 169 indicators underneath them, and nowhere is homelessness mentioned. Homelessness is completely absent. It is not represented in any 17 goals or in their 169 indicators. It's not there at all. But homelessness, we believe, intersects with every single one of these goals. How can you have no poverty if you're not also addressing homelessness? How can you have zero hunger if you're not also addressing homelessness? Because people who are homeless experience a significant amount of hunger. How can you have good health and well-being when people are living without a roof over their head and experiencing really significant negative impacts on their health as a result? So homelessness is deeply, deeply connected to these 17 goals and their indicators. But our theory of change is, if you want something to be addressed, you need to explicitly be talking about it. And that's really what we've kind of seen over the past 9 years in the implementation of these goals, is because homelessness is not mentioned, it's not measured, it's not talked about, strategies and policies are not being put into place that will successfully address homelessness. So we really need homelessness to be explicitly connected to these goals, talked about, and member states need to be held accountable for taking some action on these goals. And Anya, I'm not able to see the chat since I'm sharing my screen. So just, you'll have to awkwardly interrupt me if there are questions coming in.
Oh, I will definitely. Don't you worry.
Okay, perfect. So we had a wonderful colleague working with both IGH and the working group a couple of years ago, Joe Paget-Hertz, and they created this wonderful graphic that shows specifically through the 17 goals how homelessness connects to the overarching framework. So obviously, ending homelessness is key to ending poverty. I already talked a little bit about how people experiencing homelessness are extremely food insecure. They are exposed to different health threats. Their longevity decreases significantly with every single year that a person experiences homelessness. Education is really key to preventing homelessness in the future, because education can lead to employment that can sustain a person in their home. We also know goal 5 is around gender equity. We know that homelessness has really unique and difficult challenges for women and gender minorities. They experience gender-based violence. They have difficulties, making sure that their children are safe, that they are physically safe, and that they have access to hygiene during their menstrual cycles, things like that. When we think about homelessness and hygiene, how difficult it is to access clean water, homelessness is obviously deeply connected to climate change and to clean energy. We are starting to see much more displacement of people from their home regions because of climate disasters. So that connects to both goal 7 and goal 13. Goal 8 is around employment. So again, that connection between education and employment and self-sufficiency. Infrastructure, which is goal 9, has to do with, are we thinking about housing as infrastructure? How are cities and communities investing in housing as infrastructure, as that's a really critical part of the solution to homelessness? Goal 10 is around growing inequalities within and between countries. And I think we've seen that increase over the past 9 years, and how much economic inequality is forcing people to move from their home countries or their home communities into other places around the world, both in country and between country. Goal 11, you'll see, is the largest goal in this particular image. That's because goal 11 around sustainable cities is the closest the framework comes to addressing homelessness. There's a sub indicator, a sub target underneath goal 11 that says, we will work to ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and services, and to upgrade slums. So when the Sustainable Development Goals were included, slums were a huge focus. Upgrading slums and informal settlements was a big focus of the framework. But again, people who are experiencing street homelessness, shelter homelessness, are still left out of this goal. It does not go far enough. And we're seeing that in one of IGH's partner communities in Sao Paulo, Brazil. They've experienced a 110% increase in family homelessness on their streets since the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's because now in their informal settlements in the favelas, the rent there is now too expensive for families to afford. And I was speaking with a researcher and academic there who said, for too long, the favelas have been our salvation, meaning that was kind of the lowest kind of safety net that was there. And because it's now much too expensive for families to afford, they are now living on the streets. And so goal 11 is as close as we get to addressing homelessness within the framework, but we believe it needs to extend even further to those who are the most left behind, people who are experiencing street and shelter homelessness. And then kind of the last 4 goals, 12 has to do with responsible production and also kind of climate change, those things connecting together, because again, climate change was a huge focus of this particular set of goals. Goal 16 is around peace and justice, and that really connects to what we see happening globally right now, including in my own home country of the United States, is criminalization of homelessness. So people who are living in deep poverty, who do not have access to housing and services, are now being punished for that, being taken from the streets and put into prisons, which we know creates a revolving door between prisons and homelessness. And so that goal also deeply connected to the issue of homelessness. And then the final goal is around partnerships. This was a goal that was slid in at the last moment, just recognizing that it takes both the United Nations, all of its individual member states, the private sector, and civil society, which is us, which is NGOs and nonprofit organizations, coming together to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal framework, as well as to end homelessness. And so again, because homelessness is absent from the current set of goals, we thought that developing this particular image would help to persuade and explain to everyone just how critical homelessness is to accomplishing this really ambitious set of goals. We believe that it connects to all 17 goals in really deep ways, some more than others, but it certainly connects to all of them. And again, our goal is to always more explicitly be connecting homelessness into this framework with a really long-term view of getting an indicator on homelessness included in whatever comes after this current framework. So it was passed in 2015. It extends through 2030. So we have another 6 years at least to continue to advocate for homelessness to be included and addressed by the United Nations frameworks, and to lay the groundwork for it to be included in whatever comes next. I will pause there and see. Yes.
I'm just I'm just doing the awkward interjection.
Great, perfect.
I mean, like, this slide is, I mean, it's mind-boggling. You know, it's like if you're seeing like how closely, like how interlinked homelessness is with each of the different goals. And like, I mean, goal 11, it's like you would really think like, okay, something, surely there would be homelessness somewhere written in the SDGs, but it's actually not the case. And like understanding that is just like mind-boggling. But then you were saying before as well that like what gets measured gets done, like that is like kind of the approach within the United Nations. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, do you have like examples of like environments maybe where you could really see that the moment people were talking about homelessness and were measuring it, that it actually had an impact?
Yeah, so I get that question a lot actually, is why was homelessness missed? It seems so obvious to us that homelessness should have been included in a sustainable development goal framework, especially because they got close in terms of affordable housing and services and informal settlements, but they just didn't go far enough. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we did not have an advocacy group at the United Nations at the time when these goals were developed. So the perspective, the advocate voice did not exist when this framework was developed. It came later, which I'll get into more. But I think there was not a strong voice really working with the member states to get homelessness included in it. And you know, we all know from our work on homelessness, it's a very ignored problem. It's both visible and yet somehow completely invisible at the same time. And so I think that advocacy, that push to have it included is a really important one. And then another reason I think it wasn't included is that it is difficult to measure homelessness. We don't have good national or global statistics on homelessness. And so when you think about measuring it, you know, will it be accomplished? Won't it be accomplished? How will we know if progress has been made? Homelessness is challenging to do that with. However, I do not think homelessness is more challenging to measure than poverty. I don't think homelessness is more challenging to measure than gender equity. I think sometimes that the fact that it is challenging to measure gives member states and global organizations like the UN a pass to not measure it. It's challenging to measure any issue around social development. It's challenging to measure things that are already in the Sustainable Development Goals. So I don't think it should be an excuse to not have it included, to not try to measure, to not improve measurement over time. We're measuring things like migration and displacement. And so homelessness, again, is just another aspect of displacement. So,
Absolutely.
it can be done, it can be measured. We are getting better globally at measuring it. Right now, 78 countries already measure some form of street or shelter homelessness in some way. And so again, that's part of our advocacy at the UN is really focused on having homelessness included, measuring some aspects around it, but understanding that it's not that it won't be perfect statistics, but nothing about the SDGs is perfect. And so it
Absolutely.
shouldn't be an
But like
excuse.
we like one of the ones that just like from our work on the ground with Vincentians, like number 13 just like seems to become like so much more relevant to so many people. Like when we're just looking at the kind of applications we're receiving for the 13 Houses campaign, you know, for support there, we have so many people that are just like working in environments where you have like a lot of floods, where you have droughts, etc., where you just really need to cope with the effects of climate change and like the effects it has on homelessness. So I'm quite aware that the SDGs are up for renewal in a way. So have there been like any conversations around that, like linking these two more strongly together?
So this, I think, is where the broad Vincentian family can really have an impact. So right now, when we are within the halls of the UN, when we are talking about homelessness, its connection to climate is not well recognized because not very much data or research exists on the connection and the intersection between homelessness and climate change. There are a few things, but the more that the Vincentian family can can say, here's what we're dealing with locally.
Yeah.
Here's how it is impacting the housing infrastructure. Here's how we see people becoming homeless. That can really help us. And I'm looking at Jim Claffey too as well. That can help the working group, the NGO working group, to do a better job of connecting these things together. Oops, I think my PowerPoint wants me to go on to
That's amazing, because I'm just
next
like interrupting
section.
with questions. You go on.
Yeah, so because there's a gap right now in terms of addressing homelessness within this framework, we see, the further lack of data, the further lack of attention on this issue. There's a lack of international aid funding on this. A lot of times I'm asked, especially in United States context, well, why is the UN important? Why is this advocacy important? Because this framework unlocks international aid dollars to different parts of the world. Foreign aid offices, foreign service offices are looking at this agenda to see where they can have impact, where they can help to fund different programs. And so, all of us, I know, working in homelessness have a hard time accessing the kinds of resources that we need to do our work. And so if we are successful in getting homelessness into the next agenda, it could have the potential to unlock additional new funding streams for our work, which I know we would all really warmly welcome. We also see there's a lack of coordinated global to local policies. So we have these wonderful international frameworks that could be really powerful. I mean, imagine the world we would live in if all 17 of those goals could be achieved, even in their imperfection. That's a world I would absolutely want to live in. But it exists here, and it doesn't necessarily flow down to national frameworks. It doesn't necessarily flow down to local frameworks. Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. And I'm struck by the fact that when we were first planning this webinar, we thought it's late July, people are on holiday. Let's see how many people we will have sign up to this. And we had more than 100, Anya? More than 100 people signed up for this webinar because we don't understand it. It's happening up here. We know it's important, but we don't exactly know how. And so that's one challenge that we have in the homelessness sector, is how do we connect this important global framework to what we are doing in our own communities when this framework up here doesn't even talk about homelessness. And also, frankly, we are seeing an increase in homelessness. Of those sort of 78 countries who collect and report on homelessness, in the last round of statistics that were released, homelessness increased everywhere except in one country, which was Finland. So we're seeing, again, this lack of attention to homelessness. This lack of coordinated effort on homelessness is leading to an increase. Okay, so now I get to talk about the NGO working group to end homelessness. So it was, the framework has a gap. We recognize it as a gap, and we founded the NGO working group to end homelessness. It was founded in 2017, so it started 2 years after the framework was developed. It started as a smaller coalition, but now it's a coalition of about 30 NGOs who all have a mission that is somehow connected to homelessness. This working group was anchored and founded and is still supported by a significant number of Vincentian family branches. So we have Jim Claffey on the call today, who represents the Congregation of the Mission. We have Daughters of Charity represented, the AIC, the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. I'm sure I've forgotten a few of those branches, and I apologize for that, but there are a significant number of Vincentian folk who are active in this working group and are among some of the most active members of this working group. And so I think it's very heartwarming to see the impact that the Vincentian family can have when they come together and focus on a particular issue in a particular system like the UN. And so it's really my privilege to work alongside these folks every day, doing this work, because we are making a big difference. So here, and we're going to get even more nerdy, if that's possible, with some of the accomplishments that we've been able to secure together. So really, our accomplishments that can fit on a PowerPoint slide started in 2020, where a very small, not very powerful commission at the United Nations called the Commission on Social Development selected, through some advocacy of working group members, selected an annual theme. This commission chooses a theme every single year, and they chose one around homelessness. So in 2019, they selected their annual theme for 2020 to be around homelessness. And everyone at the working group thought, this is our shot. This was the first time in something like 20 years homelessness had really been discussed within a UN commission. And so members of the working group were able to participate in expert group meetings, in the preparations for this commission, and were able to work with the member states who wrote the resolution at the commission to make sure that things that were important to the working group got included in that resolution. When you think about the United Nations and the countries and their representatives, they're political appointees, they're ambassadors, they are representing their country and their country's interests at the UN. And so they have to negotiate resolutions on all sorts of different things. They're not subject matter experts in any single one of those topics. So, you know, if you think about a day in the life of a UN representative, a country representative at the UN, they might be going from a meeting on climate change to a meeting on wastewater management to a meeting on homelessness. Like, the amount of subjects that they have to sit at the table and discuss and represent their country on is just massive. And because homelessness had not been meaningfully talked about in the UN for so long, we really had a golden opportunity to position ourselves as working group members as experts in this, because, you know, they're talking about climate change all the time, so they're a little bit more prepared to talk about climate change or migration. But homelessness, a lot of them were like, where is this coming from? Who knows anything about homelessness? Where do we go to? And we were there, we were ready. We could show up at the expert group meetings. We could say, how about this language for the resolution? What about this? And really build those relationships and help to develop that resolution. And so we were very, very happy with that resolution that went through in 2020. That was really our first accomplishment. And we were quite deliberate about making sure that wouldn't be it, that it wouldn't be resolution and done. So we really worked hard as a working group, and we were ecstatic and delighted that it went from a very small, not very powerful commission at the United Nations all the way to the General Assembly the next year. And the General Assembly is the most powerful commission at the United Nations. And they basically passed a twin resolution. They did not make very many changes to the 2020 resolution. They kind of copy pasted it because they were like, these member states have already negotiated it, let's do this again. But they made one very important change, which was fantastic. And it said that the Secretary General of the United Nations would have to report back in 2 years to the General Assembly again. So that was the first.
That's massive.
It was massive. It was the first accountability mechanism we saw ever within the United Nations on homelessness. And so we knew as a working group, we were going to get to talk about it again. And so we worked very closely with UN Habitat, which is the UN agency that's responsible for Goal 11. And so they had to write, they were the pen writers of that Secretary General's report. And so we were able to connect them to people all over the world who work on homelessness in their local communities. So it really became a truly global report. And I can talk a little bit more about that in the next slide or so. And so then there was another resolution that then kind of responded to that Secretary General's report. So we're starting to get into this dialogue within the UN, this conversation within the UN between a member state resolution, a Secretary General report, then the member states respond again to the resolution, and there will be another report. And so one piece of our advocacy is to make sure that that continues and that each resolution and report continues to push the conversation forward, because there's a little bit of stagnancy, I would say, between those two resolutions. They need to say new things. We can't have the same, we don't want to have the conversation all of the time. But for now, in terms of the trajectory of what we've accomplished and where we want to go, for now, it's okay. The fact that homelessness is there, it's being talked about, it will continue to be talked about, is really positive. We also see, and this is not really a result of our work, I would say it's an indirect result of our work, we are seeing more countries report on homelessness in their voluntary national reviews. So the voluntary national reviews happen every year, and this is where countries report to the United Nations what their progress is on the Sustainable Development Goals. There's no specific way they have to report. They do not have to report on homelessness because it's not in the Sustainable Development Goals, but they're starting to. We see them report on homelessness under Goal 1, which is poverty. We see it reported on under Goal 11, which is affordable housing. We see it reported under multiple different Sustainable Development Goals, which again, it's connected to all of them. So that makes sense. And so at the working group, we review those reports every year. And if a country has reported on homelessness, we go meet with them. We invite them to participate with the working group in different events. And we're just constantly trying to build relationships with the member states so that when opportunities come up for resolutions and things like that, we have those connections and relationships that we can, again, be a resource to, and to influence in a way what then goes into those resolutions.
But then as well, that's like basically building your case. Like you can already show like, well, people are already reporting on it. So clearly it's very relevant in their environment. So it should be part of the SDGs more explicitly.
Yeah, exactly right. And then
Lydia,
we also, yeah.
Sorry to interject. It's Jason from DePaul.
Hi there.
Hi, I was just thinking about that because I mean it's an amazing work what you've just highlighted to us about what the NGO working group does. Is there a place for us where we possibly can, and you may be already doing this, but where member states may have all parliamentary groups to end homelessness to help facilitate a two-way sort of dialogue in relation to, I mean, I can only speak to the UK, particularly, who has an all-parliamentary group to end homelessness, about whether there's sort of lobbying to make sure that at the end of the day, the politicians are going to be the ones to put a resolution or force their governments to push matters at the UN and work in collaboration with you. Is that already happening, or?
I would say it's not happening in necessarily a coordinated way. So, you know, there's more than 160 member states who are represented at the United Nations. Our working group is 30 folks, but not all 30 are dedicated full-time to this work. They have they're volunteers, they are often working full-time and volunteering, or if they are full-time at the UN, they have a variety of topics that they are working to advocate for. But I will say specifically in regards to the context in the UK, they were hugely important to getting that first resolution through, you know, because we had good connections there, because they were calling their home office and their home office was saying, yes, this is important. So actually the UK's, I forget what the department is called now, the Department of Housing, Communities and Leveling Up or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
housing communities,
yeah.
local government now. It's been renamed after the election, but yes.
But they literally sent one of their employees from London to New York when that resolution was being negotiated, and we worked very closely with her. So when there are those connections, they have real power. But we just don't have the capacity right now as a working group or as organizations that are part of that working group to make those connections happen across 160 member states. But I do have a slide. I'm keeping an eye on time too. I do have a slide that kind of says, how can we help? How can we connect this together? So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So then just to touch on the last point here, we also see homelessness being addressed by more United Nations special rapporteurs. So there are special rapporteurs at the UN on a variety of topics. They're kind of independent reporters who do deep dives into particular topics. And so we are seeing the special rapporteur on human rights and extreme poverty start to talk about homelessness more and more and more. We are seeing the UN special rapporteur on modern slavery recently did a report on the connection between homelessness and human trafficking and slavery. And we didn't even know about it. He just kind of randomly reached out to the working group to say, hey, I did this report. Can you come onto a webinar where I talk about the report? And so for us, seeing this issue organically pop up more and more to us is an indirect result of our work getting homelessness into these resolutions and reports and just kind of seeding the atmosphere a little bit more, so that it, as Anya said, can kind of lay more of a foundation and more of a case so that post 2030, whatever that new set of goals are, whatever that framework is, it's going to be harder for them to ignore homelessness because we planted those seeds everywhere we possibly could. Okay, I will go to my next slide. I'm keeping an eye on time here. We've got about 15 minutes left. So a couple key things from these resolutions that we are seeing continue forward into the reports is we finally have what I would call a definition of homelessness. So we sometimes give ourselves a red herring challenge of saying there's no definition of global homelessness. There really is. We do know what homelessness is. We do know how to define it in terms of measurement purposes. And so we were able to get this definition into the UN resolutions and reports. And so it has three parts. It says people living on the streets who are living in open spaces or in buildings not meant for human habitation. The second part is people who are living in temporary accommodation or shelter, kind of crisis accommodation. And then finally, we say it's people living in severely inadequate or insecure accommodation. That third one is important because then it kind of links to where the UN agenda stopped, which is informal settlements and slums. And so what we are trying to do is just extend the UN's kind of went from home ownership down to informal settlements and stopped. And so we were trying to link it in with, okay, informal settlements to temporary accommodation and shelter and people living on the streets. This framework also allows for local manifestations of homelessness. So for example, our colleagues in India have asked us, what about people who are living in their rickshaws? We're not going to write a homelessness definition that talks about people living in rickshaws because that's so specific to a particular area. But what we can do with this definition is say, well, that would be either category 1, it is category 1 actually, or possibly you could make an argument for category 2. But it's, you know, a rickshaw is an open space. It's a place not intended for human habitation. And so it was important to us to define a flexible kind of framework that still allows for local nuance and for local examples of what this looks like. But at the end of the day, these three types of homelessness exist in every single country of the world. Exactly what it looks like can differ, but at a very high level, it exists. The resolutions also call for better measurement of homelessness and sharing of the data, collecting and harmonizing data on homelessness, so that one day we'll be able to answer the question, how many people are homeless globally? We can't answer that right now. We can only answer that for 78 countries. So building this framework and getting more countries to measure and then share that information is a huge aim of our advocacy. The resolutions also call for comprehensive policies and programs. We know from our work, everyone on this call knows from their work, people experiencing homelessness need a particular and specific set of housing and services in order to come through homelessness, in order to be stable again in their lives. And we can't just stop at definitions. We can't just stop at data collection. We have to be able to apply the data in ways that eventually bring an end to homelessness. That's what we want. That's why we're doing this work. And we think it needs to be done globally, which is why we've targeted the UN, because we also know, local homelessness is driven by global factors. And so we need, policies, we need programs, we need funding at global, national, and local levels to really tackle this and to really end it. We've talked a little bit already about the Secretary General's report, so I won't spend time on that. Okay, so what do we want to do next? What is the working group heading into? We're currently working with some member states on a resolution for an International Day to End Homelessness to be formally recognized in the UN calendar. Sometimes we get the criticism, oh, these observance days don't really end homelessness, don't really have a meaningful impact on the issue. That's true. And what's also true is we want to have homelessness continue to be part of a conversation at the UN. We've lived in a world for a long time where homelessness was not addressed in any way. We have homelessness being addressed now. We are looking for any lever we can possibly pull to make sure that homelessness continues to stay part of the conversation and becomes a greater part of the conversation. And so if we can get an annual observance day really enshrined in the UN calendar, that will, no matter what else happens with resolutions and reports, we will have that day to continue talking about homelessness, why it's important, why the UN needs to pay attention to it. We are advocating really strongly to have homelessness included in the Summit for the Future, which happens this fall. And more importantly, the World Social Summit, which will happen in November of 2025. The Summit for the Future this year kind of paves the way for a lot of what will be talked about at the World Social Summit. We're having challenges, frankly, getting homelessness included this fall. They want to talk again about affordable housing. And so it reminds us, we talk about this a lot at the executive committee of the working group, how important it is to just keep advocating so strongly for homelessness, because status quo is difficult to overcome and homelessness is not in the SDG framework. So the natural inclination of this entire massive system is just to go back to what's already there. And so we're working on some strategies for how we can continue to get homelessness included in these two big conversations. Part of that is building relationships with more member states to develop further opportunities. It means so much more. I wish this weren't the case, but it's true. It means more if the member state is at the table saying that homelessness needs to be included than it does for a civil society group. Civil society does not have power at the UN. The member states have power at the UN. And so it's really through our relationships with member states, with those ambassadors, with those diplomats who look to the working group as a resource, as a partner in homelessness. We really work hard to provide good, I would say, customer service to member states. Here's the research, here's the background on homelessness in your country. I have had member states say to me before, you know more about homelessness in my country than I do. We do all that prep work before we go into a meeting with a member state so that we do look like a resource to them, so that we are a resource to them, and then they're more likely to come back to us when there's a question or a conversation around homelessness. But again, that takes a lot of time and work, but that's really a focus of our working group. And then again, as I've touched on, we're taking a long view to the next set of goals post 2030. So where can we plant the seeds now so that when that next set of goals gets negotiated, homelessness will be a more obvious topic to have included. Okay, I think my next slide is what can we all do? Yes, okay, so how can you help? Please, I know you all are very active already in the 13 Houses campaign, but please continue to do it. This is the most tangible way to end homelessness as a part of the Vincentian effort. The UN stuff is extremely long-term. It is connected to what you do on the ground. But having more proof points for us to point to, having more examples for us to bring into the conversation at the UN, especially for those sustainable development goals that maybe aren't as obviously connected. So having an example of a climate event that caused a significant number of people to become homeless in your community, that's useful for us in the working group to take that to a member state, because we do our research before we go into these conversations. We will literally research the profiles of the people that we're going to meet with to say, okay, this person is really interested in climate change. So the more we can connect homelessness to that diplomat's area of interest, the better it is. So those examples are really genuinely useful to us. I would say find out if your branch of the Vincentian family is active at the UN. Find out what they're doing. Are they at the UN but not part of the working group? If so, they need to join us. So kind of digging into that, seeing if they're active. If you are an NGO and you're interested in getting the UN status that allows a civil society group to participate at the UN and you want to join the working group, please do. Again, there's only 30 organizations and not all those 30 can be super duper active. So we're always looking for more members, but getting that official UN approval to be a civil society group that can participate in UN activities is a annoying but important bureaucratic piece of how it works. I would also say champion the definition of homelessness. If you hear anyone say, we have no definition of homelessness, remember this webinar and say, actually, we do. Here it is. It's in these UN resolutions and reports, because we have the power as the sector to change this perception that there's no definition of homelessness. The way that we talk about it as the sector dictates how it gets talked about globally. So we have one. When you hear people say the state of global homelessness is terrible, you can say it needs to be better, but 78 countries are already measuring this in some way. So really be championing this, amplifying our voice, amplifying that advocacy. And then I would say, to the best of your ability, it's very hard to go from global idealistic frameworks down to what's happening locally, but there is some guidance on this. And really looking at the UN reports, and I'm happy to share those with you, Anya, in kind of the follow-up to the webinar. But look at the guidance, see if there's something locally that you can do that will align with what the UN is pushing. One specific example of this is the country of Uruguay. They looked at the resolutions at the UN and they changed their national definition of homelessness to include those three categories. And so obviously it's a little easy to go, not easy, it's a little easier to go from a global framework to a national framework. And the national government had the power to do that. But again, that was a really good, clear example to us of how this can connect. And then always stay in touch, amplify the messages as they come out. I've got the working group's website there. The working group has all the different kind of social media channels. So again, find out first if your branch of the Vincentian family is active, get in touch with those representatives. Jim and I can help you connect, and we can go from there. More hands are always needed in this work. We say a lot, there's no one agency that can end homelessness alone. We believe that deeply. We need more partners. We need more folks active in this effort. But I will stress, it's important to do it through the working group. This working group is full of experts who have co-created the strategies on this, have connections to member states. So it's important that we speak with one voice, that we have a coordinated strategy. So getting connected in through that working group and through your branch of the Vincentian family, I think is a really important part.
This is amazing, and like the first questions are already coming in.
Okay, great. I'm
But
gonna start
before,
my share so you can see you all.
yes, but before we're jumping into the questions, I just like, obviously because I'm curious as well, wanted to add in. First of all, thank you for like this amazing presentation and just like highlighting a little bit more about like the SDGs and how they relate to our work, and the advocacy efforts that you're having at the UN. But like, so one thing that always strikes me with the SDGs is like, I mean, I'm a big fan, but at the same time, they seem still very far away. So whenever I'm thinking about like our work that we're doing here on the ground, or I'm reading through applications from like for 13 Houses campaigns and all of that, or I'm reading about like any project really of the Vincentian family, it's like I always wonder, like, how can we actually make the SDGs more relevant in our work? How can we make sure that they are like that we're talking about them, you know? And but as well, like that when we're thinking about projects, that somehow they feature. And I'm not really sure that that is something we have cracked just yet. So I just wondered your take on that.
I think it can be as complicated or as simple as we want it to be. No, and I think I don't ever want to take away anything from the local work, because the local work is what ends homelessness in like day in, day out for one person at a time. That is still really, really critical and important work. At the same time, we have to be changing the bigger systems at play so that less individuals and less families over time become homeless. And I think every organization has their own role to play. And so for the folks who are running direct service agencies, it can be enough to know that this framework exists, that their work does connect to it in philosophical ways, and to know that our working group exists. We are carrying their examples, we are carrying their voices into the conversation at the UN. And so that can be enough. We can leave it there, that now they know me, they know Jim, they know this working group exists. They can get in touch with the working group even after we are gone from it, to say, hey, we've got these examples. And then the other thing is, it's important that the working group know you as well. When we come together and put together different events and panelists, we are often trying to get out of the way and featuring and highlighting the people who are doing the local work on the ground. Natalie came to New York. Natalie from the FAMVIM Homeless Alliance came to New York back in October. And we had a couple of folks from the 13 Houses campaign I think they participated virtually. We had them on Zooms sharing their stories of how they experienced homelessness back in their local communities. So having these hybrid events has connected us to all of you globally as well. So, you know, those examples, those proof points that help connect to these bigger frameworks, you know, is genuinely useful. And that can be enough, because again, I think in the day-to-day of, you know, I put myself in the shoes of someone who's running a housing program or a homelessness shelter. That person does not have time to do their own UN advocacy work.
Exactly.
And so understanding how we all have our own roles to play and understanding who's playing what role is the way we can do this the most efficiently and the most powerfully, to have that impact.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for that. Alexia from St. John's is coming with the really hard questions. It seems that housing as a human right is a point of contention or disagreement. Why would you think some people see housing outside the sphere of human rights?
Yeah, I would say for the working group, it's not a point of contention. For our NGO working group to end homelessness, we're very clear that housing is a human right. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was one of the first documents ever ratified by member states. This was in the years immediately following World War II, which is where the UN was born. How do we keep this atrocity from ever happening again? And in that declaration, it talks about the universal human right to adequate housing. And so for us, that's not a point of contention. It's very clear that it is. Now, it's a point of contention in some spheres because member states don't want to be held accountable for delivering human rights. My country does not want to be held accountable for delivering human rights. And housing is also expensive, and it has been commoditized, and it has been financialized. And so you have a very, very powerful business lobby really working hard to keep governments from taking housing on as a human right. And I'm going to split myself out from the working group here. So this is my perspective as Lydia. But I don't think the delivery of a human right necessarily means that the government has to pay for that. But the government needs to make sure that everyone has access to it and can pay for that access in some way or subsidize the access in some way for a certain percentage of people who won't be able to access that through sort of the free or fair market. So it gets nuanced, it gets very complicated, but again, as the working group is very clear. It is a human right from one of the very founding documents of the United Nations. So we're clear, we know it's sticky. And I would say, I would just add the way that translates for us as a working group is we often don't lead with that when we're going in to meet with a member state. We don't go in, very assertive, this is a human right and your country needs to deliver on it. We don't really, we'll kind of change our tactic, our conversation tactic in a way based on what we've researched and learned about that particular country.
Yeah, exactly. It would probably be difficult, like even the US, as you said, like you would probably have a really hard time to get anybody to listen if you would be saying like, oh, it's a human right and you need to stand up for that.
Yeah, exactly. Now there is a whole human rights reporting framework that's based in Geneva through the UN that our working group has not had the sort of time or capacity to tap into yet. I think it could be very interesting to work on some strategies to get member states reporting on their lack of ensuring the right to adequate housing to their citizens and the people of their country.
Well, like you clearly need a little bit of work to be left for after you get the homelessness into the SDGs, right?
Thank you, Anya. We won't do it all today, I guess.
Exactly. So from Natalie, she was wondering as well. So it's like going back to advocacy a little bit more. So if I am in charge of a 13 House campaign project that is an example of the intersection of homelessness and a sustainable development goal, how can I actually advocate for homelessness to be taken into account in my country's reports to the UN? And she actually helpfully included a couple of examples. So for example, New Zealand's project is like to house and give livelihood tools for Kiribati's climate refugees, so SDG 13, that are basically forced to migrate due to rising sea levels. And for example, Ghana, they have a project for girls to prevent human trafficking, which would like link in really well with SDG 5, like around gender equality, and target 5.2 more specifically. So if we know of these projects, and it's like, I mean, the Vincentian family is like amazing in their capacity and ability to really do more. So what could we tell them about, like any kind of options they might have to advocate more for homelessness to be taken into account?
This is a really tricky question because every single country does their voluntary national review differently. So the answer for New Zealand will be different from the answer to Ghana. The first thing to do, and I'll try to look it up and put it into the chat, is there is a website that tells you when your country is up to report. They're on a rota, not all 160-ish countries, 72, I don't know. Not all of them report every single year. I know there's 190 countries, but they're not all part of the UN. It's messy. So they don't all report every year. So they're on a 3-year rotation. So the first thing to do is to go and to look up, when is New Zealand's next report? When is Ghana's next report? All member states are supposed to have civil society consultations on these reports. They do not all have civil society consultations on these reports. They do not all publicize that they're doing a civil society consultation on the report. Like, it's very murky. as to how they do this consultation or don't do this consultation. And so then the next step would be to try to figure out who in New Zealand manages that civil society consultation and to try to advocate to them. Again, this stuff takes a ton of time. And so we don't have an expectation that someone managing a direct services project is going to have the time to do it. But if they did, that's how you would do it. I think it would be important for the working group to know if you are doing that outreach, because then the working group can talk to the New Zealand representative to the UN in New York City to say, do you know who leads the voluntary national review in New Zealand? And then could be talking to the 13 Houses Project. And so that we have both the connections in New York connecting to the in-country connections in New Zealand, and just making sure that those strategies are all clicking together and supporting each other.
Yeah. Like one of the sentences that we had like in our description, like for the webinar, was actually to understand how organization can work in coalition to help influence global policy development and priorities. Is that exactly it? Is that what you're referring there to?
I would say through the working group. Yeah.
Fantastic. Now, I think that sounds really good. And that feels like so much more tangible in a way, right? It's like if you know, like, okay, this is something like people I can get in touch with quite easily.
I don't want to pretend this is easy or clear, and we do run up against a lot of brick walls. Like sometimes we really cannot find out who is doing what according to what timeline. Like it's a lot of turning over stones, and sometimes there's something under that rock and sometimes there's not. So I can't stress enough how much time this kind of advocacy takes.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine. I mean, it's like what you were saying before about like having that kind of international day that is like anchored within like the UN, and that is like the day around homelessness. I think this would like help because it would just like resolve around like one area. And like Jason actually asked whether or not you feel that having such an international day tie in with World Homelessness Day on the 10th of October each year, if that would be something that would be useful and could help.
Yeah, definitely. So there already is a global observance day. It's not officially recognized by the UN, but so while we're working on that, there's October 10th is traditionally World Homelessness Day. And so we just don't know if that's the day the UN will settle on, but put October 10 in your calendars. At the very least, there's always some social media conversations around World Homelessness Day. And I believe the working group is doing an event sometime in October around the voluntary national reviews, because those are all being posted now. So there will definitely be things that you all can participate in terms of World Homelessness Day.
Fantastic. And another quite tricky question, testing you on your knowledge on the SDGs and their progress. Because like the last 2024 report on like SDGs says that there are only 17% of the SDGs that are actually on track, and some are regressing to pre-pandemic levels. So people were wondering, why do you think that we're behind so much in like tackling these issues? And obviously like especially homelessness? What are like the main
effects? If you compare the reports before and after the COVID-19 pandemic, it becomes really, really clear that pandemic set the SDG framework back a significant amount in terms of poverty, in terms of gender equity. Like, so there's never any one particular thing, but the pandemic had a huge negative impact on our world's ability to deliver on Sustainable Development Goal framework.
Do you think like there's hope yet? Sounds like very depressing.
So I think that hope is an action, not a feeling. I don't know who said that. I certainly didn't invent that. Someone much wiser than me said that somewhere. And so even when we do not necessarily believe or feel in our hearts that there is hope, we should still be taking action. Because I think if we do that, if we do that, then we've given up. And things will continue to deteriorate. And so I think all of us on this call, all of us who are connected to and through the Vincentian family know that we need to continue working for the world that we want, even if that's not necessarily the world we're going to get. But we continue to act. We continue to act in hope, even in moments when we don't feel hope at all.
Well, and like if, for example, one of the big things that we're hoping for and that we're taking action for so that we can implement that is to get homelessness in the SDGs, then in a future where that has already happened, because obviously it's not a question if, but when, and the SDGs mention homelessness quite specifically, what do you think, what kind of impact and effects this would have in the short and in the long term? That was a question from Laura.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that are really key for me. One is international aid dollars. International aid dollars are tied to the SDG framework. So if we want increased resources and funding for homelessness, getting them into the SDGs has the potential to unlock that for our local work, for our national work, those types of things. So funding opportunities is huge. And I think measurement as well. Again, measurement through the Sustainable Development Goals is a little bit tricky, but getting better, more accurate measurements of national and global homelessness to know if it's improving or, you know, not over time is another really important function of the SDGs.
Yeah. Fantastic. And like I mean, it's like, they do sound like very unachievable at times, right? Like the SDGs, but I think like you just like breaking it down and like being like, okay, so if we can get homelessness into it, actually that would help us to do like that everyday work. So there's a real purpose in doing like this entire advocacy. And it actually isn't like that far away if you think about it.
I would also say some countries really pay attention to the SDG framework and really turn those into national plans. My country does not. I do not think that the UK does, but some countries really, really do. And that's why, you know, for IGH in particular, and also for the working group, like we are not focused on any one particular country. So if getting homelessness into the next framework positively impacts a dozen countries, even if the United States is not one of those dozen where IGH is headquartered, that's still in service of our global mission.
Absolutely.
And so it may be more important for certain countries than others, but for us, because we work globally, it's a huge focus of ours.
And we have like another question from the Vincentian Foundation in the Philippines. What concrete outputs, indicators in the local level do we expect to happen, which could be considered results of the initiatives of the Working Group to End Homelessness? So how does the Working Group to End Homelessness ensure its integration with varied local contexts of homelessness globally as it advocates homelessness with the UN? Wow, that's quite a bit if you need me to reread, but I think incredibly relevant to the conversation.
I can see it. I can see the question, and it's a great question, and it totally makes sense. So in terms of concrete outputs and indicators in the local level, we don't have any expectation of that right now. The working group is focused on the global policies and the global frameworks. That's kind of step one, is getting that included. We can't, as a group of 30, we can't do global and local. So the best things that we can do is to bring the local voices into the global conversation. And we do that through our events, through the examples that we share in those events, through the examples that we take to the member states that we're talking to the panels that we sit on. So making sure that we are bringing local examples into the global conversations. And I think someday we can start to say, okay, we've got it in here globally. Now we've got the time and space and capacity to link all those things together. But for now, our priority is just focused on the global the global system. And there are some connections and links right now to the national level. So for example, Uruguay taking the global definition of homelessness, connecting that, changing Uruguay's definition of homelessness to match, that's going to have more implications than for how they handle homelessness in Montevideo, the capital city of Uruguay. You know, so there can be those connections, but it's not an immediate, and it's not always a clear connection.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question from Joan Carreño. If you just want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I see in the chat, Rebecca Googled "hope is an action, not a feeling," and it's from Brene Brown, who is a US-based researcher. Thank you, Rebecca.
Oh, amazing. Well, thanks for that quick Google. Yuan, over to you.
Hola, buenos días.
Buenos días.
Soy Juan Carlos, pertenezco a la familia Vicentina aquí en el Perú. Tenemos un proyecto con la Alianza 13 Casas de la familia Vicentina. En este tema de trabajar estratégicamente nos hemos involucrado con el gobierno. Pero ¿hay alguna dificultad cuando uno trata de solicitar apoyo internacional para el proyecto 13 Casas, o sea, o para implementar el proyecto de viviendas y en la lucha con el sinhogarismo, contra el sinhogarismo? Pero a veces hay dificultades cuando nosotros hemos establecido una alianza con el Estado. Por ejemplo, el terreno donde se construyen las casas es un terreno del Estado que ha sido asignado por tiempo indefinido a la asociación Color Esperanza que tuvimos que fundar para poder sacar adelante este proyecto. Y en algunas instancias, cuando hemos solicitado la cooperación internacional, eso resulta ser una dificultad porque como trabajamos con el Estado, nos dicen entonces que sea el Estado quien también se encargue de esa dificultad, ¿no? O sea, ¿cómo podemos hacer para que sea bien visto el hecho de que si nosotros como ONGs o como asociaciones particulares de la sociedad entren en alianza con el Estado, no nos digan luego, bueno, ustedes ya no pueden recibir cooperación porque ya están trabajando con el Estado? ¿Me entienden? O sea, como que diciendo ya que se encargue su Estado, ¿no? Que se cargue su nación y entonces nos vemos en esa dificultad de cómo es que entonces podemos hacer entender que si trabajamos con el Estado es también para poder ampliar la posibilidad de ayuda, ¿no? Pero otras instituciones no lo ven así y nos limitan, a veces no nos permiten contar con esa ayuda. ¿Cómo podemos hacerlo entonces?
Yeah, it's a common challenge. You're not the only person who is struggling with that challenge. I would say this is why goal 17 of the framework is so important. Goal 17 talks about partnership to achieve these goals. And the example that you shared is an example of where there is not partnership for those goals. The international agencies are saying, well, it's the state's responsibility, and they're not working in true partnership. I think you could try to share with those international groups the resolutions and the reports on homelessness that clearly state that homelessness needs to be addressed by international, national, and local actors. I don't know that that will convince them, but you could try. And you could try the same thing with the state as well. You know, showing the state that this is an international issue, and show them also the resolutions and reports that call for multi-sector, multi-layered collaborations towards it. Again, I don't know that it will be successful because a lot of times it's coming down to the funding streams. But that's a tactic that you could try, because we have that written into all the different resolutions and reports that it takes many different actors to address the issue of homelessness at national and at international and at state levels.
I think just like your expertise and really like working across all these different networks will be really helpful for people. So I think I would encourage probably people on the ground. So you and you, like as you just did with asking a question, but as well others to reach out to the working group if you do have these kind of questions, because I'm sure you're not the first one to ask. I'm sure you're not the first one to experience these kind of challenges. And I feel that the working group will probably be in a really, really good place to respond to you and hopefully provide you some level of expertise and knowledge. But as well, like we had like another question from Natalie actually asked about like a national coalitions to influence policy. And she wondered if you do know of countries that do have like national homelessness civil society coalitions, and whether or not you are in contact with those. And that might be as well like a way forward for you and like these kind of civil society coalitions that might help.
Yeah, we do know them. I think the sector itself does not always think about homelessness as a global issue.
Yeah.
I think we have been trained to think about it as a local or a national issue. And so we know the national coalitions, we talk to the national coalitions, and they often either don't see the need or don't have the funding to participate in international and global conversations. In fact, I had one leader of a national group say, my board has told me that I cannot participate in global conversations. They want us to focus on the national conversation. So I think we as a sector have a need and a mandate to talk about homelessness more as a global issue. I think that the migration and displacement we are seeing from climate change, from wars and conflicts, from growing inequalities has given us more of an opportunity to frame it as a global issue than ever before. So we're starting to see some movement there, but historically, in general, it's been perceived as a local or a national issue. It's why we don't have funding for international and global efforts. Like it just is not seen as a global issue. It's not narrated as a global issue. So we've got some work as a sector to do there.
Absolutely. And I'm quite aware that we are 5 minutes out from this webinar already being over. So it passed really quickly. So if anybody has any other questions, your time is now. You can either raise your hand or you can pop the question in the chat. But Lydia, it's like if
one hand up, Anya.
Say again.
I see
that's
one
like
hand
still
up.
Yeah, that's still young. I think
okay.
the question was like answered. So I think that one is probably just like a leftover. If it isn't young, if you had like a follow-up question, please just unmute yourself and you're more than welcome just to interject. But Lydia, like apart from joining the 13 Houses campaign, what is like your biggest wish list for like Vincentians on the ground to help you, the working group to end homelessness, and the IGH to actually get homelessness into the SDGs?
I think the examples are very useful. I think being in touch with the 13 Houses team about those examples, they know how to get in touch with the working group. So sharing those examples of how you see homelessness in your community, if you have any data on it, and then if you're willing, at certain points to either speak on one of the working group's events or connect us to people who are experiencing homelessness in your community. I think those local connections are important to us. Those local examples are really important to us. So be thinking about that and be connecting in with the 13 Houses campaign. And then we'll make sure as a working group that when we do plan those events, we're connecting back into the 13 Houses campaign just to make those connections all happen.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We didn't get any other questions in, but I always say that oftentimes people need like a moment to digest all the information that was presented. So if there are any other questions coming up towards like the end of the day or later this morning, I know we're in different time zones, please feel free to send them to us and we'll make sure that Lydia gets them and can respond to them.